Welcome, Alexander Natz. Great to have you with us today. We will talk a little bit about the European environment, and of course, it's a pleasure to listen a little bit to you and your experience and what you think what Brussels, the European Union, can do to support the healthcare system and patients in Europe. So, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you very much, Herbert, for having me. It's a great pleasure.
Let's start directly with one of the three building blocks that we want to talk about, GPL, the General Pharma Legislation. I think there was a political alignment last year, and now we are moving into implementation phase. Where we are and what are the important stuff that you want to look into?
The General Pharmaceutical Legislation is a key cornerstone, I would say, when it comes to the revision of the pharmaceutical legislation in Europe. And it's really important that we ensure that in Europe we are taking the right legislative steps to really also work on our competitiveness. And the General Pharmaceutical Legislation has been a legislative file which has been around for the last 3 years. And it has, as you're saying, there has been a political agreement in December last year in the Council and with the European Parliament and also with the European Commission. We're waiting for the final text to be released probably on Friday this week, so there will be some news. And there are key cornerstones when it comes to exclusivity rights. How is market exclusivity for orphan drugs to be defined in the near future? What about regulatory data protection? It's not going to be the 8+2 years as we know it, but it's going to be modulated. So there's a lot news regarding intellectual property rights for the pharmaceutical industry. But there are also some launch obligations for the pharma industry, which we can talk about later on.
No, thanks, Alexander. So it will be a critical moment to get this English text, of course. Do you think that it will send a signal also to the different healthcare system stakeholders about the competitiveness of Europe, the readiness of Europe to drive into this future environment? Especially if I look into this geopolitical situation that we see right now with the US, with MFN, the tariffs, but also with the competition maybe out of Asia.
Absolutely. I mean, that's a very important point. I mean, for me, this is a cornerstone to work on our competitiveness in Europe. It's really key we are doing that in a timely manner because the geopolitical landscape has changed so dramatically. When we look at clinical trials, I mean, China is really the front runner these days. Clinical trials are very much initiated in China and in Asia, but also in the US, but less so in Europe. So that's something we need to work on. And the Biotech Act, which is another piece of legislation pending, which we're going to talk about later on, is about to address that phenomenon and the fact that we're falling behind when it comes to clinical trials. The General Pharmaceutical Legislation, which is which will be the legislation as of 2028 at latest, some provisions will come into effect earlier, is key when it comes to market access considerations, but also is key when it comes to intellectual property rights. I mentioned the modulated IP rights, so that's really critical.
Thank you very much. When I'm reading the drafts and the text, I see that there is also an accelerated speed to access, especially for EMA and regulatory processes. Do you think that's the right direction to go?
Absolutely. Thanks for that question, Herbert. I think when it comes to regulatory, my feeling is that we are really competitive. I really would like to say that the decision making in the European Medicines Agency is science-based, and I think we are really competitive and cutting edge, I would even say, when it comes to EMA. You might not always be satisfied with any outcome of a marketing authorization process at EMA, but overall we have the impression that we can live up to our expectations in Europe. So speeding up those processes, cutting a bit short on some committees to make the agency more lean and more structured in a way, while maintaining the competency to deal with orphan drugs and also ATMPs is probably the right thing to do, and that's what's happening in the General Pharmaceutical Legislation. Not to mention the regulatory sandboxes, which allow for a lot of flexibility, which we have seen happening in the pandemic times, and also the so-called platform approach, are very important milestones to make our system, our regulatory system, flexible and really forward-looking.
Would you think this also in the context of the changes that we see ongoing in the US with the FDA, for example? Also here we see that there is an intention to maybe speed up the process, to have a different way of evidence requirements from the authorities. Any direction that we have here from EMA as well?
Well, to be honest, I mean, in my understanding, there is a very close collaboration and interaction between EMA and FDA, and I think that's so important because those are the two big territories when it comes to innovative pharmaceuticals where those medicines are launched. They are launched in Europe and in the US. So it's really key that our regulatory agencies have this interactions, maintain that interaction. And let me also say, it looks like there is a bit of a competitive angle to the positive, really watching what is the other agency doing? Are they doing something for the benefit of patients? Are they doing something which could speed up and shorten approval timelines? So I think there is a bit of a matchmaking or a monitoring going on, and I think that's very positive. That's a competitive edge that we need.
Very good. We will not talk today about the EU HTA regulation, but as this is going in parallel with the EMA process, do you think this is another direction where we think we can speed up to bring innovative medicines to patients?
Well, honestly, I think when it comes to the EU HTA, we really have to wait for the first JCA reports because we really have to see the outcome of all of this. And it's very easy to criticize a system that hasn't produced any outcome, and we wouldn't want to do that. I think we rather are well advised to wait what the outcome will be. I think the first reports are expected still in spring. So let's wait and see what the outcome is before judging a book by its cover. I think that is very important. It has the potential to really increase the competitiveness of Europe. So I do see the JCA as a very positive thing, but the devil is in the detail, and we need to wait and see what the outcomes are. There are some signals which are less positive, if I may say. I mean, some bigger companies have withdrawn their marketing authorizations on important products. Some smaller companies are considering to delay the launch in Europe, and that might also be due to the fact that there is most favored nation policies in place and so on. So it might not all be due to the JCA and the EU HTA. But I would definitely say let's wait and see what the first outcomes are.
Yeah, no, it's important, of course, that there is a good intention, reduce bureaucracy and complexity for manufacturers in the whole system, of course, to go for equality so that patients across Europe get the innovation at the same time or as fast as possible, and speed up, of course, the entire thing. If we meet this criteria, then it's, of course, a positive thing, but we have to see if this works.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. Good. Let's move on with the Critical Medicine Act. What are here the cornerstones and the situation right now?
I mean, the Critical Medicines Act is really about shortages, and it's really about taking the lessons learned of the pandemic. I mean, we had some shortages in important products, and I would say less so in innovative medicines, more so when it comes to generics. And I think that should be the direction of travel for the Critical Medicines Act. It should focus on a list of critical medicines in generic, which are primarily generics. Technically speaking, it could also be a blood product, it could also be an innovative medicine, there's no doubt about it. But I would say that the products, as we've seen on that list, are primarily generic. So this is a key focus in our understanding for the Critical Medicines Act. And what we have criticized a little bit is that also there are essential medicines, which are then the innovative medicines the system would like to see, and they could also be put on a list, and it's not entirely clear how that list will be constructed and which product will end up on that list. And I think that's the uncertainty which companies see when they face or when they're about to launch their products in Europe. We do want to tell them whether they are on a certain list, whether they have certain obligations to produce in Europe, or for those essential medicines, whether there is a discussion about joint procurement, which is certainly a game changer, I think, for many companies, because many of our members would consider it important that we first do the EU HTA properly to have a common understanding about the value of a medicine before we're even getting into discussion about joint procurement. I think that might be at some point in time a step, but it's not the magic solution for market access in Europe. So that's a bit the critical part, the unpredictability and the fact that we're not only looking at those products which have been in shortage, which was primarily those critical medicines, primarily generics. So we have been criticizing why do we have to bring in innovative medicines, and why do we have to bring in joint procurement at that early stage when we are not clear about the outcomes of the JCA.
Who will influence this list? Is it the politicians? Is it the healthcare stakeholders, the clinical experts? Do you know, can you tell a little bit about the process?
I think it's a bit of all of them, probably not the politicians, but the other stakeholders you've been mentioning will play an incremental role. So to say, if a physician or a pharmacy testifies that a product is in supply, in shortage of supply, then that product has a certain chance of ending up on a list of critical, if it's critical, to end up on that list of a critical medicines that is in shortage. And we're already doing that today. I mean, if I have a shortage in Germany, I need to list my product with BfArM at a given period of time. Now that depends on how shortage is defined. That's not always clear, but there will be one list, and I think EMA, our regulatory agencies, also the national competent authorities, will play an important role in setting up that list of critical medicines, and then also making sure that there are no shortages. And don't get me wrong, I mean, that measure is not criticized. We need to make sure that we don't have shortages. We need to work on our resilience. We need to make sure that we have certain products available also in times of crisis, health crisis, pandemics, and so on. We really need to make sure that we have a good resilience in Europe, so we have availability. But it's not an issue so much of innovative medicine so far. That's at least what we've seen in the last 5 years.
Great. Alex, let's go to the Biotech Act. I mean, the primary goal of the GPL is market access and innovation, if I see it right, and of the Critical Medicine Act, it's more supply chain resilience, yes. For the Biotech Act, it's global competitiveness. Would you agree?
Absolutely, and that's good, and it's timely, and we need it now, if I may say. So the Biotech Act is really a piece of legislation which we had high hopes to see it, and it was released last year. And I think certainly it has met some expectations, especially addressing the need for clinical trials to make sure that we're working on our competitiveness for clinical trials. I mentioned that before, is key. Because let's not forget about the fact, if we have a clinical trial running in Europe, we will also have very good chances to have that product later on launched in Europe, because patients are already having access to that medicine in the context of a clinical trial. So for me, clinical trials and the Biotech Act is key for ensuring that we have a good market access in Europe, and we should work on that competitiveness. So it's really a very important first step in the right direction.
Yeah, I mean, clinical trials is a big topic right now, which I hear in every direction. So in China, there are a lot of clinical trials happening these days, but also in the US, of course. Do you see a decline right now in Europe, or?
I mean, the figures are very clear. We have a decline of clinical trials in Europe, and that's partly due to the complexity of 27 EU countries, partly due to the fact that ethics committees are organized at the national level, which is, there's no EU competency to deal with ethics committees. That slows down the process. Those different requirements, those national requirements slow down the process. But it's really good that we have identified clinical trials as a major milestone to work on our competitiveness, because the intention with the clinical trial regulation was certainly to increase the level of clinical trials in the international context, and the result has been that we have been decreasing at the end of the day. So also it took 10 years to get it up and running, and it hasn't really delivered the results as intended, so we need to fine-tune there, and that's very important.
No, thank you. And I think also that there is a difference between big pharma, maybe has more experience, has a bigger organization to manage that, while there are startups and small biotech companies which cannot easily manage this clinical trial situation. Or
well, I would say it's probably, I think it's relevant really for both, for the multinational companies and the smaller companies. I also see some smaller companies. CRISPR-Cas9 has been tested in the University of Regensburg in Germany. I also see some of our members, smaller companies, doing clinical trials in spinal muscular atrophy in German centers. So it's really relevant for both. We want to attract both innovation, both clinical trials and multinational companies, but also smaller companies, and I think both is possible and is done actually at the end of the day.
Thank you very much. We spoke about GPL, Critical Medicine Act, and the Biotech Act now. If you see all these regulations and legislations moving forward, what is your key conclusion or recommendation to move forward successfully as a stronger Europe?
I've seen a shift in policy in Brussels, really, when it comes to the competitiveness, and I think that's really important to mention. I do think that all three institutions write competitiveness of the industry, also the pharmaceutical industry, in bigger letters than what they have been writing that objective in 2 years ago. So I think there has been that shift. That's really important. However, I still see that there are policies put in place that really have the potential to be seen outside of Europe as an obstacle. And I mentioned 3 examples. One example is really the whole discussion about joint procurement. If I have to tell a small company you have to deal with all EU countries all together, while it's not even clear what the JCA will tell us, whether that JCA is really having a positive outcome, I think there's a lot of uncertainty added to the table by just spelling out that political objective. The second example is the launch obligation. The much we do understand that a centrally approved medicine should, in an ideal scenario, be launched in all EU countries. But it's also important that we realize that this is not easy to do for small, but also I think for mid-size and big companies to do in 3 years' time. And then we're sending the signal, if you don't manage, you get a reduction of intellectual property rights, which I think American and Chinese companies, which we want to attract to Europe, will see with some distance and really ask, like, is it overburdening the system? So that is my second example. And the third example is really, let's also be quicker in what we're doing, working on clinical trials, also looking at the existing legislation, what can we change in administrative practice, not always having new policy objectives and new files of legislation, which are also important, but they will only materialize in 3 or 4 years from now. So by then we will have seen a lot of changes in the industry. So we need to get a bit quicker as well, I think.
Yeah. Thanks, Alex. That was very insightful. I think it's important, as you said, that we reduce the complexity. We are now in times of fast changes in the environment in general. We have to make it fast, but become predictable at the same moment for industry to invest, for also clinicians, patients to know what they can expect, and also for politicians to set the frame for everything. So thank you very much for this nice dialogue, and always happy to have you here.
Thanks for having me, Herbert.